Welcome to Justice Talks, a webinar series hosted by the General Board of Church and Society. We are glad that you've joined us today. If this is your first time with us, the General Board of Church and Society is dedicated to the work of living faith, seeking justice, and pursuing peace. By addressing more than 30 social issues on which the United Methodist Church has claimed a position, Church and Society communicates with policymakers and leaders around the world with the mission of transforming the world. We seek, according to our social principles, to apply Christian vision of righteousness to the social, economic, and political issues of today. Dear friends, if you would like to explore past conversations, recordings from previous webinars can be found on our YouTube page. We will be placing a link in the chat now so you can easily access those resources. Throughout today's program, we invite you to participate by submitting your questions in the Q&A box. We'll do our very best to answer as many as we can during the dedicated Q&A session following the panel discussion. Today's webinar is titled Justice Talks, a Grace Over Greed Update. Thank you all for joining us for this important conversation. Together, we're going to take a closer look at the current federal budget process in the United States and what it means for our families, our communities, and for our collective witness as people of faith. We'll explore three main areas: the recent budget reconciliation debates, the upcoming continuing resolution, and finally, the concrete steps that United Methodists can take to advocate for grace over greed. We are honored today to have four panelists with us today. All of them bring valuable expertise and perspective. I'm pleased to introduce the Reverend Camille Henderson Edwards, Senior Executive Director for Advocacy, the Reverend Dr. Becca Edwards, Climate and Energy Fellow with GBCS, Colleen Moore, Director of Peace and Justice with the General Board of Church and Society, and the Reverend Kendall McBroom, Director of Civil and Human Rights with the General Board of Church and Society. Thank you to all of our panelists for being here. Let's dive in right away. Our first topic is budget reconciliation. Camille, you've been closely following how reconciliation debates impact programs like SNAP, which is the Supplemental Nutrition Assistance Program, as well as Medicaid. Can you walk us through what's at stake for families and when we look at the changes in food assistance and health coverage? And when we say reconciliation, what are we talking about?
Yeah, well, thank you, Bishop. And I'll also say hello to everyone who's placing their information in the chat. It's wonderful to see everyone joining us from all parts of the world. So for budget reconciliation, what we mean by that is the bill that was just passed, and budget reconciliation is essentially a tool, legislative tool that the Senate can use to pass measures relating to federal spending, revenue, the debt limit by a simple majority, so 51 votes. And it's a powerful tool because it makes it easier to pass spending measures because it only takes a simple majority vote. And so that is the context of what we just exited out of. So budget reconciliation, Congress went through that process of looking at spending and setting certain spending levels and limits for the current budget using a simple majority vote. We have termed it, or it has been termed as the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, and we often reference it as the Reconciliation Bill or Reconciliation Package. And so through that process, for myself, I am the legislative director for the Economic Health and Gender Justice Portfolio. And so through the budget reconciliation process, the priorities for me were looking at SNAP and Medicaid, Bishop, as you have mentioned. I think it is important to note here that what we have seen in this bill is extremely harmful. The impacts of this bill as it relates to both SNAP and Medicaid, this bill will take away health coverage, food assistance, and raise costs for families. What we've tried to lift up within our Grace Over Greed updates is that there is a flow, right, of taking money from social safety programming for things like SNAP and Medicaid, and giving additional money to wealthy communities through things like large tax breaks. And so I'm sure we'll get into that conversation as the webinar progresses. But I'll speak to SNAP and Medicaid within budget reconciliation. So within SNAP, cuts total to about $187 billion. Um, which is reducing and or eliminating benefits for about 4 million people over the next decade. This is the most significant and most damaging restructuring of SNAP in history. Likewise, cuts to Medicaid, CHIP, ACA marketplaces total to about $1.1 trillion. Those cuts will take place over the next 10 years. And so how was this done? Within SNAP, there is a tool within SNAP called the Thrifty Food Plan, which determines benefits for participants or enrollees. This tool, called the Thrifty Food Plan, was made cost neutral, meaning that even as costs for groceries and food rise, the amount of food that enrollees or the amount of money that enrollees will get as SNAP benefits does not. So the Thrifty Food Plan was made cost neutral. There were harsher SNAP work requirements. So the age for work requirements increased from 54 to 64, meaning that older adults will have to show efforts of work and meet those work requirements in order to be eligible for SNAP. Um, with that alone, I have noted that the CBO, the Congressional Budget Office, estimated that about 2.4 million people in total would be cut from SNAP under that provision. So, Thrifty Food Plan, cost neutral, harsher work requirements for SNAP. Also, they're shifting costs for SNAP to the states. So, starting in October of next year, the federal reimbursement for SNAP for the administrative costs will drop from 50% to 25%, meaning that the states are now responsible for 75% of the administrative costs for SNAP. And then lastly, something that I'll note for refugees, for asylees, those with humanitarian statuses of survivors of domestic violence or human trafficking, those who have immigrated to this country will no longer be eligible for SNAP under this budget reconciliation bill. So within that, that's about 90,000 people who will lose food assistance really quickly. Likewise, under the provisions for Medicaid, those categories of restricting work or expanding work requirements, making it harder for people to have access to Medicaid, that was also increased to 64 for Medicaid. The bill also makes it harder to retain and renew Medicaid coverage. So, whereas states would have to conduct a process of determining eligibility once a year, states will now have to do that every 6 months, starting in January of 2027. Also, starting in October of 2028, I'm saying these dates because that I think also was strategic and that there are some things that were made effective immediately, and then there are some things that are rolling out over time, which is why I'm noting the dates. So October 1st, 2028, all states must charge some cost sharing for every non-exempt service. So currently, most states where Medicaid has been expanded, they charge no cost sharing. That will now change. And research has shown that even a modest increase in things like having participants or enrollees pay co-payments will reduce usage of care, meaning people will not be able to or are discouraged to seek care because of those costs that they will be responsible for. And because of that, it's estimated that roughly 15 million people will lose healthcare coverage and become uninsured by 2034. So this is over the course of when these provisions will be put in place. So I'll pause there, and I know we have other portfolio priorities as well.
Well, thank you, Camille. It sounds like this is going to have a generational impact on many of the communities and people that we serve and worship with in our churches. Thanks for helping us see how these choices directly affect people's lives. And of course, the budget also touches climate and disaster response preparedness. So, Becca, as I turn to you, can you share how funding decisions for agencies that many of us are familiar with and some may be less so, like the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, and the FEMA, what we know as FEMA, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, shape our ability to respond to climate change and disasters? Why are these cuts so concerning? I'm thinking about maybe it was this past July in Texas with the deaths that took place with the flooding. Uh, can you help us understand this better, how this will impact?
Yes, thank you. So, yes, you mentioned the disaster in Texas that happened on July 4th, and that's a really good example of a situation where we can see how the three agencies work together. So, NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, is the that has both a research and an operational arm. So NOAA is responsible for issuing warnings about severe weather, including extreme precipitation like we saw in the Texas Hill Country in July. They issue the warning, so when your phone tells you you have a flash flood warning or something like that, that's coming from the National Weather Service, which is part of NOAA. It's a world-class agency that does tremendous work and provides a significant amount of economic benefit for the amount of investment it receives. And then, of course, there's FEMA, which is the Federal Emergency Management Agency. That is the body that is responsible for, most people know it because they respond to disasters, and not just natural disasters like floods or hurricanes, but also other kinds of emergencies as well. And the federal emergency management response is in support of state emergency management response. So when the states are overwhelmed by the scale of a disaster, FEMA it comes in and helps support state agencies in responding. But another thing FEMA does that's really important when it comes to disaster response is actually in the area of resilience. And so a really significant amount of work they do is involved in going into communities when there's not a disaster happening and helping them to prepare for making improvements to drainage systems, for example, or having programs of improving roofs or something like that in a place that's prone to hurricanes. So those resilience programs have been enormously popular because it benefits communities in multiple ways, right? It makes them more resilient in the face of a disaster, but it also provides benefits that go beyond disaster readiness. And then we also have the EPA, which is the regulatory agency that helps the U.S. respond to climate change. They have research, but also they regulate things like carbon dioxide emissions from industry and other sources within the U.S. So these three agencies are really important for communities in the U.S., not only because they provide a comprehensive approach to responding and adapting to climate change in the U.S. NOAA is responsible for warning of impending climate impacts and also severe weather. And EPA is responsible for regulating the emissions and quantifying the emissions that are coming from our industries and other sources so that we can make improvements in those going forward. And FEMA helps us both prepare and respond to natural disasters. And one thing is worth noting is that it was about a year ago today that Hurricane Helene made landfall on the Gulf Coast and made its way up into the southern Appalachian region, causing really significant loss, just not only economic loss, but also very significant loss of life. So we know that disasters like Hurricane Helene and like the floods in Texas that we've already talked about are made more likely in a warming climate. And studies show that most Americans are aware that climate is changing and that we are more vulnerable than ever to natural disasters. So this is just not the time to take away funding and staffing from these really world-class organizations, these agencies that help warn us of not only severe weather, but also future climate impacts, that help us prepare our communities to be resilient in the face of natural disasters, and who help us to respond and recover once a disaster happens.
That perspective on climate resilience is very powerful. Let's consider also another area where funding priorities are our big question: defense funding and gun safety. This is something that I've been involved with for a number of years, but Colleen, I want to turn to you. What stands out to you in the defense and weapons provisions of this budget? And what do you see as the implications for communities at home?
Yes, thank you so much, Bishop Trumbull, and thanks to everyone for joining us today. So the budget reconciliation bill added an additional $150 billion in defense, and it brought the total fiscal year 2025 defense budget to more than $1 trillion.
Oh my God.
Which is it's just a massive number, especially as, Camille mentioned the over $1 trillion that were cut from, healthcare, billions of dollars cut from SNAP. And so it's just a massive number that I think a lot of us can't even conceptualize that number.
Get our heads around.
Right. So this added defense spending also included $25 billion for what is called the Golden Dome missile shield and $15 billion for nuclear modernization. And just for some background context, this Golden Dome missile shield, it's a proposed missile defense system that President Trump announced a few months ago that has a price tag of $175 billion, but there's no plan or details outlined on it. And it's proven to not be an effective use of defensive resources. Missile defense is not reliable. It's extremely expensive as well. And you also mentioned gun safety as well. So the bill also deregulates and eliminates the $200 tax on purchasing or making silencers, short-barreled rifles and shotguns, and other dangerous weapons under the National Firearms Act. So for almost 100 years, these weapons have been regulated. Until now, silencers and short-barreled firearms, other than handguns, have rarely been used in crimes because of these protections. And under the National Firearms Act, when we had these provisions in effect, for example, the shooters in the Tops Massacre in Buffalo, New York in 2022 and the Lewiston, Maine 2023 shooting, they were unable to access silencers. But this provision in the budget reconciliation bill will make it much easier for violent criminals to escape or to secretly bring dangerous guns into crowded areas. So above all, like I said, you've heard from Camille and from Becca that so much funding has been taken away from climate resilience, healthcare, food assistance, and cutting foreign assistance, again, undermining human rights reporting, while continuing to add to a ballooning defense budget that does not make Americans here at home or people abroad safer. So our lawmakers are really prioritizing weapons and war at the direct expense of peace building and other services our communities really need.
We're literally taking money that could be utilized to make lives better across the country, across all perspectives, and pouring it into things like defense and other things that we haven't even covered on. Finally, immigration is also being drawn into these budget debates. Kendall, what do you observe about how asylum protections and border security funding were handled in the reconciliation process? Some of the numbers I've heard just are astounding in terms of money that's being poured into uh, border police and so forth.
Absolutely. Thank you, Bishop, and to my colleagues who have kind of highlighted in so many ways funds that are being taken from programs that would help people and placed into programs and areas where harm is done. So one of the sharpest concerns in the process, the budget reconciliation process that we saw was asylum access. Several amendments were introduced, such as a narrow definition of a credible fear claim, making it harder to make that claim of fear in one's country of origin. They also sought to fast track expulsions under a Title 42 style public health authority and broaden expedited removal without judicial review. On top of this, there was a proposed delaying or even blocking of work permits for asylum seekers. These were all recommendations throughout this budget reconciliation process. These measures were sold as cost saving reforms, but the truth is they gutted U.S. asylum law, denied due process, and made it harder for people fleeing persecution to find safety. During the reconciliation process, we also saw the piling on of financial barriers, a $1,000 application fee for those with asylum with no waivers allowed, and a $550 fee every 6 months just to renew work permits. At the same time, reconciliation directed staggering sums of money toward law enforcement. Between 163 and 171 billion dollars was earmarked across proposals for immigration enforcement and border militarization. More than 46 billion was allocated for border wall construction. Around 8 billion went toward border patrol hiring, vehicles, and surveillance infrastructure. Nearly 30 billion was dedicated to ICE deportations and detention operations. And upwards of 45 billion over 4 years was projected for new detention centers, including facilities for families and children. In the same vein, during the reconciliation process, there were provisions that stripped away support for immigrant families. Millions of lawfully present immigrants, refugees, asylum seekers, parole recipients, and TPS holders were placed at risk of losing access to some of the things that Reverend Camille mentioned earlier, such as Medicaid, CHIP, SNAP, ACA subsidies, federal student aid, and even Medicare. And millions of children, many of them U.S. citizens, were excluded from the child tax credit. These conversations were what were apart. Simply stated, the reconciliation became a vehicle for pouring billions into jails, walls, and deportations, while cutting healthcare, nutrition, and family supports. It punished instead of protected.
So across the board, whether we're talking about healthcare friends or climate, defense, or immigration, we're seeing the ways the budget decisions reflect values. It's been said that a budget is a moral document. And too often those values prioritize wealth and weapons over people and progress. Let's turn now to the continuing resolution and what it means for the months ahead. Camille, the continuing resolution has been framed as a stopgap. What does it actually mean for health coverage and families' access to affordable care? And continuing resolution, what might that actually mean?
Yeah, thank you for that. So, if this were a normal process, if things were to go ideally, the appropriations process is the process by which the government appropriates uh, 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 spending levels for several areas of government. And so there are usually 12 spending bills or appropriations bills that are considered by Congress uh, that are, you know, debated, passed, approved. Um, and then the next fiscal year depends on those 12 spending bills. So the fiscal year for fiscal year 25, the year that we're currently in, ends on September 30th, which is in a few days. And fiscal year 26 starts October 1st, meaning that if no funding measure, either via the 12 appropriations bills or some sort of legislative vehicle is passed, then that means that so if no funding measure is passed by September 30th, then that means that the government does not have funding and will shut down. And so a continuing resolution is a legislative vehicle that Congress can use to essentially extend uh, spending efforts or spending measures for an identified date. And so, what we're looking at, so what happened, what we all saw last week was that the Republicans in the House offered a clean continuing resolution, meaning they made no changes. There were no added poison pill writers onto the bill. And so they offered that. We saw that the House passed that, and it was rejected by the Senate. So, uh, Democratic leaders Schumer and Jeffrey countered a continuing resolution. The one that was offered by the House sort of like extended that deadline to November 21st. The one that is offered by Schumer and Jeffries would essentially extend the deadline to about October 31st. And their counter bill, so the one from Schumer and Jeffries, focused on things like the permanent extension of premium tax credits for the ACA marketplace place coverage. So ensuring that tax credits for healthcare would be extended. It focused on things like reversal of the one big beautiful bill, the budget reconciliation bill, the Medicaid cuts that were passed, they would be reversed. So all the things that I mentioned at the top of this conversation, the $1.1 trillion that had been cut from Medicaid, their counter would address that. And then other things like restoration of, you all will recall, public broadcasting funds that were eliminated. So they're trying to address that as well. Specifically within SNAP and Medicaid, a clean continuing resolution means that all the things that I listed at the top of this conversation will remain the same until November 21st, meaning that there is no opportunity to shift the cuts that have been passed. What is concerning, specifically as it relates to the tax credits, is that if Congress fails to renew those tax credits, 22 million people will see a massive spike in their insurance premiums.
My
Uh,
God,
so
my
the
God.
thread is that uh, such legislation is making it more and more difficult to access the things that we need, to access healthcare, to access food assistance, and things of the like. And so a clean continuing resolution does not necessarily mean that that is a good thing. We want the opportunity to be able to fight against some of the cuts that have already taken place for these programs. And so we have until September 30th. So as the Senate has rejected the initial continuing resolution, we have until September 30th to figure out what that legislative vehicle will be to avoid a government shutdown.
It's a critical reminder, such a critical reminder of the human impact that these we speak about numbers, but these are people, families, communities that will be critically impacted. Becca, I want to turn back to you. What does this resolution allow when it comes to disaster response, and how does it compare with to what's needed for agencies like NOAA and NASA in terms of climate and science funding? I keep hearing about cuts in research and cuts to these agencies, and I'm here in DC and a meeting met people even today where they have family members who've lost jobs. So maybe you can help us understand the impact.
So fortunately, the clean CR does have language which specifies that FEMA will have access to funds it's using to respond to disasters it's already working on, as well as access to funds for any disasters that happen in the period covered by the CR. So and that was important given that we are currently in hurricane season until the end of November, and so the possibility that we will have another, storm or something to deal with, it exists, regardless of what's going on with the federal budget. So that's good. But what the Clean CR does not do is address, like what you said about the cuts that have already been made to these agencies and some of the changes that have been made through other mechanisms that have really tied the hands of FEMA when it comes to disaster response. One of the things that was a big problem in FEMA's response in Texas was that there was a new rule made that any expenditure greater than $100,000 had to go through the secretary's office. And so that really limited the ability of the agency to respond as it normally does to these kinds of disasters. The Schumer and Jeffries CR, on the other hand, does have some extensions to support climate, energy, and science programs at some of these agencies we've been talking about. It would give NASA and NOAA more flexibility to spend funds that they need to maintain their facilities and to fund ongoing research. It would also require the administration to spend funds for the Department of Energy on programs from energy efficiency to security and emergency response. And I know I didn't mention DOE earlier, but the work that Department of Energy has done recently on energy efficiency, it improves bills, or the electric bills for regular people, that improve energy efficiency in their homes, as well as reducing our dependence on fossil fuels burning for electricity generation, which is a positive thing for climate. So there is more flexibility offered to our science agencies and our disaster response agencies in the Jeffries and Schumer CR, but either way, the agencies will continue to be able to respond to disasters.
Thank you, Becca. Now, Colleen, I'd like to bring you in on the defense side again. What stands out to you in the continuing resolution about defense spending? We said a little bit about this, and the choices that lawmakers are making between military priorities and people-centered programs.
Yes. So, on a positive note, much like Becca was talking about with certain funding, I think it's positive that the CR does not include funding for new programs. We were especially worried that certain weapons systems could be added. There was a White House request for an extra $3.9 billion for nuclear powered submarines that wasn't added, largely because, as Camille was talking about, the Republicans really tried to keep the CR clean, free of policy riders to try to ensure its passage. But as we're seeing now, I mean, that continues to mean that means ballooning costs for Americans while they can't reach a decision. So I think it's really telling that White House priorities included, nuclear powered submarines instead of negotiating with Democrats on healthcare subsidies to avoid a government shutdown, to fund priorities that the American people need. And I'll just say throughout the entirety of the appropriations and authorization processes. So, for example, I've been monitoring the National Defense Authorization Act and the state authorization bill. So those respectively authorize funding and provides authority for Department of Defense and Department of State activities. It's really remained clear throughout this whole process that funding peace building and humanitarian assistance are not priorities. What we've seen in these bills are more nuclear weapons funding, policies that increase tensions in the Asia Pacific to confront China, security assistance to countries like Israel on both defensive and offensive weapons, further security assistance to the Philippines. And so this has all resulted in that recklessly high defense budget that I talked about. And I think lawmakers are really trying to utilize these budgeting and authorization process, especially the NDAA, to push forward their priorities, like codifying the closure of USAID, for example. So there's so much language in the NDAA and these key appropriations bills and the CR that definitely go against our social principles that explicitly states the church deplores war and all other forms of violent conflict and urges the peaceful settlement of all disputes.
You made reference to USAID funds in my recent travels to Africa, and even in recent conversations here, we've seen the impact, the negative impact. And even while the church has tried to step into some of the stand in the gap in some places, really our government resources, and particularly our government resources, really have historically, through bipartisan support, have supported programs that brought health and address hunger and pandemic diseases globally. Finally, Kendall, immigration remains a major point of contention in these negotiations. What are you seeing in terms of border security riders and the risk they pose for humanitarian programs?
Yeah, some of those riders are mandates for the new border wall construction and bans on removing existing barriers. There's also restrictions on humanitarian parole programs, such as those for Afghans and Central American families. And there is expanded deportation authority, making it easier to expel people quickly while limiting their access to legal counsel. I know that and why this is a scary thing is even since I just received this not too long ago, 1,800 people who have been detained by federal law enforcement, by ICE, have gone missing. I mean, no record of them. And what we are seeing in this in the CRs and what we saw during the budget reconciliation is really a dismissal, a very harsh dismissal of people's general humanity, of their dignity that they are deserving of. The financial picture here is just as stark. ICE funding currently sits at $9.9 billion. That's 485 million more than the previous 2 years. CBP, which is operations budget, is requesting 20 for the year 2025, nearly 20 billion for staffing, facilities, and surveillance technology. Border proposals that are tied to this debate that we're currently seeing include 69 billion for hiring 5,000 new CBP officers, upgrading infrastructure, and expanding enforcement. At the same time, humanitarian support is under threat. The Shelter and Services Program, which Congress funded in the budget year for year 2024 at 650, is at risk. SSP is the program, the Shelter and Services Program, is a program that helps local governments, nonprofits, and faith-based organizations provide food, housing, transportation, and legal orientation for migrants. If this funding is stripped, cities and churches across the country will be forced to shoulder an impossible cost while billions or more are poured into detention and deportation. This is a very stark picture. It's a very but unfortunately, it is the reality that we are living in.
We have to be, I've often said, we have to continue to be ambassadors of hope and motivators of resilience. But I think the question that we frequently hear, and I hear often, is what we as people of faith can do in response. So, Kendall, as I ask you and will ask your colleagues as well, for those listening today who want to take action, what are the most immediate steps United Methodists and people of faith can take to make their voices heard in this critical moment in history?
Yes, I'm going to highlight two things that anyone, anywhere in the world can do at this very moment. The first is that you could go to umcjustice.org, our website, and take part in our action alerts that are direct messages to your legislators. These action alerts that are on our website, highlight all of the things that my colleagues and I have discussed today. Very pertinent issues, priority issues of high priority. Your voice matters, and together we can ensure in filling out these action alerts and taking action that dignity and justice are at the center of these budget and these financial negotiations. I'd also submit that you can call and write your lawmakers. Urge members of Congress to protect asylum access and preserve humanitarian funding. Ground your advocacy in the social principles which affirm the dignity of migrants and the dignity of children, the dignity of women, the dignity of so many people, and reject the punitive measures that we're seeing in this at this current stage.
Thank you, Kendall. Becca, what does it look like to build coalitions? We spend a lot of times in our work with GBCS and building coalitions and working with others, especially directly impacted communities that are impacted directly, and interfaith partners, so that we're supporting people as well as pushing for policy change together.
I'm so glad you asked, because I really wanted to talk about what a good job the faith community does at responding to natural disasters. Our faith-based disaster relief organizations are some of the first groups to be on the scene after a disaster strikes, and they're among the last to leave. They're trusted partners, and it's not just a bunch of random volunteers. It's skilled people that have had experience working in this kind of work and can really make an important difference. So there's lots of different ways to plug in if that's something you're interested in doing. At each annual conference, you can participate in a disaster response team training that is offered at different times throughout the year. And then you get trained in how best to be useful after a disaster. And then after something happens, then a team is put together and sent out to offer relief to families and communities that are impacted by disasters. That's a wonderful program. The United Methodist Committee on Relief is sort of our denomination's big disaster relief organization that does a lot of work in communities, both preparing for natural disasters and responding to them, and so supporting them financially or using their website to be more informed about opportunities that they might offer you to become more involved would be a really great place to look as well. Global Ministries is doing some work right now in disaster resilience and preparation. So that would be another really good place to plug in and look for more information if that's something you're interested in. And something that happened at the last general conference that's of interest in this area is that now each annual conference will be having a new position called the caretaker of God's creation. And so that movement is just getting off the ground. So now's a really perfect time to get involved if you are interested in issues like climate change and environmental justice, to sort of shape what that role is going to look like and what kind of work that role will be responsible for. And so if your conference has filled that position, you can find out who that is and get in touch with them and talk about your interest and maybe support them in their work and be part of that response. There's numerous. You mentioned the interfaith piece, and there are, if your disaster response team or any other United Methodist bodies are not active in your area, there are lots of ecumenical disaster relief organizations to get involved with. Even your city or state, just civic organizations that work on even park beautification or other efforts. Just get involved in your community, get to know people, and certainly, as Kendall said, contact your members of Congress and let them know that you are a person of faith and climate change is important to you, and you think it's time for the federal government to act responsibly on this issue.
It's a powerful call to partnership, and I think it's very timely. Camille, I want to turn back to you. I know we only have a few minutes before we want to turn to questions from those who put in the Q&A, but I want to turn back to you. Can you tell us how tools like the Creating Change Together toolkit can help local churches and individuals plug into this work, and any other resources? I guess if we all go to umcjustice.org, we can link to that.
Yes, certainly. Our website has a host of resources as well as an online store for persons looking to buy documents in stock for churches, Bible studies, youth groups, all of those things. I really do want to lift up the Creating Change Together toolkit. I'm not sure if you can, there we go. But it's a physical book that communities can purchase or download off of our website. The reason why I think this is brilliant is because as we prepare for our work as advocacy staff, legislative directors going into congressional visits, one of the most powerful things that we can bring into those meetings is story. And so I've been looking at the chat. I'm looking at stories of persons who have shared that they're already getting notices of change for their insurance costs. I'm mindful. I saw that there were several people from North Georgia Annual Conference, proud member of the North Georgia Annual Conference, but also, in the past, I think it was this year, that several hurricanes swept through North and South Georgia, and churches are still actively trying to rebuild their churches and their communities. All of those direct experiences inform what we say in those congressional visits. But what we find is that we need a little bit of massaging of how we tell that story, of how we get our thoughts together to be able to concisely and effectively communicate what our lived experience is, which is why this toolkit is really important. It will literally give you a step-by-step instruction of how to do that, asking questions of if you are committed to issues of climate justice, where does that commitment come from? Where have you seen persons who have been directly affected by lack of food assistance programs? And we are showing up in this space specifically as people of faith. And so it asks questions that allow us to think through, why does our faith tradition inform us to act in this way? So I think one of the greatest ways is to go to the website, to download or purchase the Creating Change Together toolkit, where you have a physical copy. And if there are communities within your church, within your area, that are looking to collaborate together, this would be a guiding document and a starting point for you all to access. So I will lift up that and my advertisement.
Okay. Thank you, Camille. Uh, I know empowering local church leaders is very important to all of us. Colleen, I know that's part of your work. I'm a big fan of the annual conference, Church and Society, and Peace and Justice coordinators. Uh, what role can our church and society chairs play in moving this advocacy forward in conference and congregational levels?
Yes, this is really important in order to further advocacy on these issues we've been talking about today in your conference. So, according to the Book of Discipline, each annual conference shall have a conference board of church and society or its equivalent and a peace with justice coordinator, or it might be called something different. So, there's not a formal description of exactly what these positions are responsible for, but generally, they coordinate the planning and implementation of programs that align with the social principles and work to connect congregations and the conference with resources and people like GBCS and others for advocacy and transformation of the world. So these positions may look different in each conference, as each conference board may be organized slightly different across conferences as far as what they're called or exact issues they advocate on. But the General Board of Church and Society is committed to building relationships with each of these conference boards by providing educational resources, building and sustaining relationships, and helping to mobilize networks to engage in social advocacy and action. So just looking at the attendance list here, I know a few of you on here do fulfill one of these roles, and I'm also happy to put you in contact with your church and society chair, your Peace with Justice coordinator, or their equivalent. I know my colleague Amber Gaines already put her email in the chat. She also predominantly works with the church and society chairs and helps with the Peace with Justice coordinators alongside myself. So I'm also happy to put my contact info in the chat and encourage you to get in touch. So thanks so much.
Thank you all for sharing both the challenges as well as the opportunities before us. We should feel empowered and encouraged to do the parts that we can do. We've been seeing We've seen today that budgets are never just about numbers, friends. They are about values, about lives that are made more secure and those lives that are also put at risk. With that, I'd like to invite Camille to help us address your questions and reflections.
Yeah, so I have been scrolling through some of the questions here, and I will start. And maybe as you all, Colleen, Kendall, and Becca are led, we can talk through these. One of the questions that I see: what are ways we can engage college students from the Wesley Foundation to become advocates for social justice?
I guess I can jump in on that. So that's a great question, and honestly, something that I think we've been trying to do since we've been here. And I think one significant way of doing that is hearing from our Wesley foundations, hearing from our students, what is it that we can provide in the way of um, opportunities to meet with legislators virtually, to express their concerns, to express both the rooted theology and their lived experience to legislators again understanding what or knowing what their particular concern it might be SNAP or it might be things within Reverend Camille's area or Reverend Dr. Becca's area with climate control, climate care, or Colleen's as it relates to defense. And I know that we've done she has done a lot as it relates to the Palestinian struggle and things going on in the Middle East. And so those are ways in which we offer ourselves as resources and the agency as a resource, as a in so many ways as a vehicle to become engaged in that. And so if there is anyone that would like to further engage, I'll also put my email in the chat to connect, because that is something that we love to do. I do know also that with college students, we have in our education department, the EYA internship, where youth are able to come for the summer, or they stay where they're at and we meet virtually. And that has been I know, a major program of GBCS and has had great impact, as well in local communities and with the the social justice journey that many of our students are on.
Great. I will direct this to Colleen. Maybe you can reflect on the question. They're asking if we provide resources for churches to use to gather signatures from congregations to let legislatures know what we think about certain issues. Can you speak a little bit to the sign-on process, what that might look like, and how people might be able to engage?
Yeah, thanks for that question. So, yeah, I do think that grassroots engagement from congregations is really, really important to put pressures on key legislators. Like, I know part of the question was, uh, can we put pressure to resist the change of the naming of the Department of Defense to the Department of War? And I think it is really important to, yeah, galvanize people within your congregation, within your community. And I know Amber already put in the chat the link to our action center where you can find our action alerts. And so I think that's a really easy way to email your legislators about key issues, at least that, we've issued certain action alerts on there. But even beyond the action alerts, we definitely encourage you to try to meet with your legislators. And the specific question on gathering signatures, I think it is really powerful when you meet with a congressional staffer and you say, I have 100 signatures from faith leaders in your district, because at the end of the day, lawmakers, what they care about is reelection, right? And I mean, of course, they have, values, they have certain issues they care about, but they want to hear from their constituents. And so if you do go into a meeting, if you send them an email with, X number of petition signatures for a certain kind of policy change, I do think they listen to that. I do think it is taken seriously because they do want to be reelected, right? And they want their votes and what they're prioritizing to reflect what the views are of their constituency. So I think, there's a few different ways you can take action with our action alerts, gathering signatures. I don't know if we have a specific resource on gathering signatures. But I think the toolkit that Camille mentioned, the Creating Change Together toolkit, like she said, it really goes through the process of how you can be advocating. And one of them is, emailing and meeting with your lawmakers. So I think it provides a really good outline of how to do that.
Thanks for that.
You ought
Okay.
to be reminded also that lawmakers spend time in their home districts,
Yeah.
so you don't have to come to Washington, D.C. Just find out when they're in their home districts.
Yep. Absolutely, especially during the month of August recess. Just because it's recess, that doesn't mean that they are not working. It means that they have more time to spend in their district. Really quickly, I have a question that I'll shoot to you, Becca. We've talked about church and society chairs and peace with justice coordinators, and you've mentioned caretakers of God's creation coordinators briefly. Can you share a little bit about your engagement with the coordinators and the partnership that we're building since it was passed at General Conference?
Yep, like I said, we're just starting, so we're continuing to shape and learn what we can do for each other. But I'm super excited that we do have the caretakers of God's creation now, because I think it's just nice that we're going to have someone who's focusing on these issues with intentionality at each annual conference. So right as of right now, those caretakers they gather once every other month for like a coordination call where they talk about what's going on in each annual conference, and they strategize and learn from each other's experience. And at the moment, I'm participating in those calls just to offer a quick update on what's happening with federal legislation and opportunities for them to engage with that process.
Thanks, Becca. Okay, we are 3 minutes to the hour, and so I will try to give. It seems that the remaining questions are around budget, talking about rescission. So we saw that a rescissions package was passed, meaning that the government took back money that they had already been authorized to spend, and so as you can imagine, that caused a lot of tension, but then also a lot of hardship for those areas where money had been already allocated as it had been taken back. Um, and so the rescissions process is all of these budgeting processes are just layered on top of each other. So as money has already been taken back, we are now layering on top of that, hopefully, passage of a continuing resolution so that the government does not shut down. The rescissions were for fiscal year 25. The continuing resolution and hopefully some sort of spending legislative vehicle will be for fiscal year 26. I'm also seeing questions about oh, this is harder than it looks to do this live. Additional resources. So we've placed in the chat multiple times that we will follow up with additional resources. One person did ask about a resource that talks about the specific timeline of when elements within the budget reconciliations package, when those things go into effect. There is an organization called the Center for Budget and Policy Priorities that is very much trusted here in DC. We serve on coalition boards with them. They have created a comprehensive tool outlining exactly when specific provisions will go into effect as a result of the budget reconciliation package. So we'll be sure to add that into our follow-up as well, along with any other resources that have been mentioned in our conversation today. I will send it back to you, Bishop.
Thank you, Camille, and thank you to all of our panelists. This brings us to the end of our discussion today. I want to offer a heartfelt thanks to all of you who joined us today, and as well as our panelists, and let you know that the audience for joining today has been critically important to this conversation. A recording of today's discussion will be added to the UMC Justice YouTube page, and we also will send you the link in a follow-up email so you can revisit the conversation or share it with others in your network. On behalf of the General Board of Church and Society, we want to thank you again for spending this time with us. Keep in mind a quote from Ruby Bridges, who said, "We may not all be equally guilty, but we all are equally responsible for building a decent and just society." So, on behalf of the General Board of Church and Society, thank you for spending this time with us. Blessings to each of you as you move through the rest of your day. Stay encouraged. Don't forget to go to umcjustice.org and make sure you have a copy of the social principles. You can order that through Cokesbury or go to umcjustice.org.